Om Asato Ma Sadagamaya Tamaso Homaham Jyoti Gamaya Mrityormam Amritam Gamaya Avir Ahavir Maedhi Rudrayate Dakshinam Mukha Te Namaham Pa Inityam. Om. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality, and reach us through and through ourselves, and evermore protect us from ignorance by thy sweet, compassionate face. A good subject, work with detachment. That's our subject this morning. And we're going to be talking about one of the fundamental themes of this Vedanta philosophy, that is karma yoga, and how to spiritualize everyday life. And we can begin with a very realistic situation as it unfolds in the ancient Indian epic, the Mahabharata, or that is the Bhagavad Gita, where it is on the eve there, or the morning, very morning of the great Kurukshetra, the battlefield of Kurukshetra, the war between the great civil war between the Kauravas and the Pandavas. And as the scene opens, Arjuna, who's one of the 5 Pandava brothers, he's there together in the chariot with Sri Krishna, that is his mentor. And Arjuna surveys the whole battle. I mean, all of the armies are drawn up, all of the chariots, all of the horses, and all of the elephants. And the battle is about to begin. And Arjuna, looking over this, seeing and anticipating as he has this terrible civil war, and anticipating all of the death and the sorrow and the loss and the killing of his kinsmen. He's overwhelmed with the thought of the consequences of the battle that he's about to be engaged in, and overwhelmed with anxiety and confusion and reluctance to act, spirit of pacifism or whatever, he sinks down in the chariot. He's paralyzed. He can't act. He doesn't know what to do. And at that time, Sri Krishna, that is the voice. This is the voice of Vedanta. Sri Krishna, the divine incarnation, sees immediately that this is not a moral dilemma. This is not a psychological problem, but rather, like all of our problems in life, it's a philosophical problem. And in light of that, Sri Krishna launches into the great discourse, the 2nd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, which represents the very highest teaching of the Vedanta philosophy. And that is very simply that you are a divine immortal soul, that you're not the body, flesh and blood body, born, grows old, and dies, in battle. You're not the mind, the waves of thought and feeling and emotions. You're not the role that you play in the melodrama of life. You're not the person that you think yourself to be, but rather you are the spirit. You are a divine spirit soul. And the spirit is unlimited. It's infinite. The spirit is not a person, it's impersonal. It's the impersonal witness of the body and of the mind and of the unfolding of the actions in the world. And the spirit is by nature unchanging and invulnerable and immortal. And it's fitting here that that this dialogue takes place there in the chariot. That is, there is Arjuna, who is the charioteer, and then you have Sri Krishna, who is standing next to him. This is the old-fashioned, in old-fashioned times. And in the Katha Upanishad, we read the great unfolding and description of the analogy. Atmanam ratinam vidhi, shariram ratam tu, buddhim tu, saratim vidhi mana, pragraham evacha. I quote you one verse, two famous verses, in the Katha Upanishad, where it is in fact kind of visualizing or anticipating this exact situation on the battlefield with the chariot. And in there, it describes, it's an analogy. And this is a good heuristic for us to understand our subject this morning. This analogy of the chariot, and in the Upanishad there says, the body is like a chariot. The horses are the senses, that draws our mind outward. We're engaged in the world, are like the horses. The buddhi, that is the mind, it is like it's like the reins of the horses. And the intelligence, that is our intelligent self, is like the charioteer. But in addition to that, there's another person, there's another being there in the chariot, and that is the rider in the chariot. That's the higher self. That is the Atman who rides along in the chariot. The rider in the chariot, that is Sri Krishna, does nothing at all. He's not engaged in driving, he's not engaged in the battle, but by his mere presence, he is the inspiration and the source of all that is happening. All of the movement of the chariot and the action of the battle is the play, as it says in the Bhagavad Gita, it's the play of the gunas in Prakriti. That is to say, it's just the play of the forces of nature. And all of the action is being done by the horses, by the movement of the chariot and the charioteer, that is by the body and the mind. But the soul, the self, our true nature, remains as the detached witness and the detached observer of all, and remains unchanged, characteristic of spirit. Trying to define for it. It's defining in our mind what is spirit. Well, one characteristic of spirit is, well, we'll talk about this in a minute, but the thing is, there's the image of the chariot and the charioteer. Now, coming up, we're going to have the Krishna Puja. Here's where we have some talk about Krishna. once upon a time, there was the gopis of Vrindavan were on their way they were going to cross the river Jamuna to sell, these are the milkmaids who were devotees of Sri Krishna. And they're carrying along with them the products of their farm, that is the milk and the cream and the curd and the cheese and the butter. And they're on their way to market. But they come to the river Jamuna. And there the river it's the monsoon season. And the river is in full flow. These poor gopi girls, they stop. What can they do? The vast river flowing. No way that they can cross. They look over, and there they see that underneath a tree, there sits a sage. You know he's a sage, long hair, long beard. There he sits. They recognize it's the sage Vyasa. Vyasa's been around for like hundreds of years. Well, there he is. He's sitting there and meditating under the tree, and the gopis, they go over and ask Vyasa for his help crossing the river. Yes, Vyasa says, yes, I see what you're saying. He said, but you know, I'm very hungry. Maybe I can help you, but can you give me something to eat? And so they unpack their baskets. They give him some curd, and they give him some cheese, and they give him some butter. He gobbles all that up, more, and they give him some milk. Well, he eats almost all of their food. Then now he feels okay. So he gets up, stands up, goes over to the river, and he says, "Oh, river Jamuna, if I have eaten nothing, then let your waters part." Okay, sure enough, the waters of the Jamuna, they parted like the Red Sea. Pathway opened between them. Gopis were very happy. They went across that path to the other side. And so that's the story, old story of the sage Vyasa. And the moral of the story is that, well, although it seemed at first glance that Vyasa was engaged in a vigorous action of consuming and eating all of that food, it seems that on some level that he remained in inaction. And he did nothing at all. That is, Vyasa worked with detachment. We could say that, well, detachment, it's all about identifying with your true self, the Atman, your higher self. Vyasa is identified with his higher self, and hence he does not arrogate to himself, that is, he's not identified with the body and the mind, even though the body and mind are acting, and because of that disidentification, he doesn't arrogate to himself any of the fruits of the results of the karma. And thus he's free. That is, he hasn't been entangled in the vicious circle of karma. Now, I'm presuming a lot this morning. I'm assuming that you're all students of the law of karma and understand. You see, in order to appreciate the subject, that is, we're talking all about work with detachment, how to become free from karma. You have to have some background knowledge about what's the problem. So we're assuming that we understand what is the problem. The problem is we're caught, we're laden with chains of the links of the vicious circle of karma which pervades our whole life and all of our action. Maybe we give an example of just to take a mundane example of a regular for example, a nurse who's working in a hospital, who comes into that profession with very high idealism. She's motivated really by the spirit of charity and compassion. And thus she begins her work, and as she ministers to the patients, she does so with great sympathy and with great empathy, and identifies with each patient, working personally with them and helping them. But she is in a profession in which she has to work in a situation of great emotional intensity. That is to say, it's a job in which she is under a lot of stress. There is pressure, there's tension, and there is and so gradually she begins to, every day she has to kind of ride the roller coaster of the emotional ups and downs, her successes and failures of doing that work. And as a result, it may be weeks, maybe months, begins to feel kind of burned out. And lost a lot of that spirit of high idealism, a very common scenario. Problem is, she has become attached. She's become attached to her action. That is to say, she's naturally has lost perspective. And therefore is working more as no longer working as a master, but now reduced to kind of working as a slave. And as Swami Vivekananda says in the Karma Yoga, which is a source of our subject this morning, that man alone, these are the words, here I'll quote you the words, that man alone will get the best out of life, who, that man alone, having the power to attach himself fully to the work at hand, reserves also to himself the power to detach when he should do so. Now we see in the case of the nurse had the power of detachment. That's very good. She was able to identify. She was able to bond with her patients. She was able to work with great concentration and personal interest and sympathy and empathy. All those are positives. What's not a positive is, if that becomes attachment, that means you lose the power to detach yourself when you should do so. And so the question is, how can we work with detachment? Now let me try to set up this question. Here's our question. The question is, in the form of, I'm going to share with you this the famous analogy of the two birds, which appears in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, Mundaka Upanishad also, Dva Suparna, Suja Sakaya, Samanam Vriksham Parisha Swajate, Tayor Anya Pipalam Swadvatya Nashnan Nanyo Vichakashiti. Beautiful verses, two verses, ancient times, 3,000 years ago. They're discussing the same subject that we're discussing this morning. And The analogy here is that there are two birds which are seated on the self-same tree. One of them eats the sweet and the bitter fruits, and the other bird on the uppermost, highest branch looks on without eating. That's the analogy. The lower bird lives on the lower branches and spends his day hopping around from one branch to another, looking out, looking for sweet fruits, finding a sweet fruit, eating that, getting a bitter fruit occasionally, and he's completely distracted by engaged in karma and enjoying the fruits of his action. Meanwhile, there's another bird high up. When he looks up, one day maybe he's eating there and he gets a particularly bitter fruit and he looks up. And there on the uppermost branch, there's a second bird. And the second bird is sitting there calmly, majestically, the witness of the whole forest. Looking on over the forest, calmly, without eating. And the lower bird looks up, sees that, thinks, yeah, I wish I could be like that. So thinking, he jumps up one or two branches, then gets distracted. Because he starts looking more finds some sweet fruits. Soon he gets another bitter fruit. Terrible, stops, looks up the branch, looks up at the top of the tree. There he sees that calm, majestic bird seated on the highest branch. Completely fulfilled and satisfied, looking on without eating. And he thinks to himself, yes, I wish I could be like that. Hops up a few more branches, gets distracted again. And so like this, we can see the bird gradually is moving up the tree. Now, as we can observe there, we watch, we see, well, the bird, as he moves up the tree, his whole perspective is changing. Moving higher, he's from the lower to the higher. His whole view, his world view is changing. As he moves higher up the tree, he's getting much more sunlight. He sees much more clearly. His vision of the higher bird emerges with much greater clarity. And he begins to feel at some point he kind of loses interest in those, in eating the sweet fruits. He's satisfied. And looking up the higher bird, maybe impulsively, he makes the last few jumps up. And then a wonderful thing happens. That is, where there were two birds, there's really only one bird. And really, there was only one bird all along. And we know how, if we're walking through a forest, and maybe the branches, the trees, and the leaves, maybe a gentle wind, the wind is blowing through the trees, we know. The sun is shining. Maybe there are shadows that play in the branches of the trees. And sometimes those shadows maybe create illusions. And so similarly, here it appeared as if there were two birds. And yet really there was only one bird all along. Now, let's look at that analogy. Because that's kind of the idea. The idea is there are two. We have apparently, that is, the teaching of Vedanta is that there is a real and there is an apparent man. There seem to be two selves within us. That is, there's me, there's the self with the small I. And then we can say maybe there's the self with a capital I, my higher self. And so it's the first thing we have to clarify in our mind is, who is this higher bird? And you have to ask yourself, I mean, this is the whole of Vedanta philosophy, do you believe in this analogy? Does this analogy make sense? If so, who is the higher bird? Now, this morning I'm giving you, we could say, for example, that the higher bird is just your potential future self, your visualization of yourself as you could become if in the future. If you are very successful and you activated all of your potential, maybe that's your imago. That's your future potential that you could become. We could interpret it that way. That's kind of maybe a psychological interpretation. We could also give this analogy a kind of a more religious interpretation, and that is we could say that the higher bird is something like God. And we're down here, God's up there. And this morning, however, all of those analogies are good. Those are positive analogies. Those are different approaches to this subject of karma yoga. We'll take those approaches on other occasions. But this morning we're emphasizing a third approach, that is a philosophical approach. And that is, we're identifying the higher bird as your true self. So let's begin with that. The higher bird in the analogy is your true self. Notice the claim here. These are strong claims, philosophical claims. That you have a higher self. That there's something higher and lower. Now what does that mean? That means that that you have a self. The first thing, let's say, is this. That this is not potential self. This is who you already are. This is your true self. And in that sense, it's higher. That is, there is a self within us which is more real than the self that we think ourselves to be. That is, that's our true self, the real and the apparent man. So the higher self means that it has a higher ontological reality. Furthermore, that the higher self is not our higher self is not engaged in the relative workings here of the law of karma. It's a completely, that is to say, it's remaining calm, detached, it's immovable. It's not participating in the world of action. That's because it is impersonal, not a particular person. You have an impersonal self. See, these are all philosophical claims. You have in addition to your persona, the Greeks call it the persona, the mask that you wear, you are an impersonal self. That's your true self. And the true self is immovable, and it looks on without eating. That is, it is actionless. These are the claims of the Vedanta philosophy. You see if you accept this, if you believe it. That you have a higher self, which is an actionless self. And the question then is, how then can we, our question then this morning is about detachment. How can we, it's the lower bird. We're like the lower bird on the tree. And the lower bird, we're asking the question from the standpoint of the lower bird, pecking at the sweet and bitter fruits, looking up at the higher bird. The question is, how can I be like that, is our question. How can I be like that? And, well, the answer to that, well, there's no magic wand. We're just using the analogy. There's no magic wand is waved. What's happened? We see the lower bird has pecked at the sweet and bitter fruits. That is, he has learned from experience to take steps up, to move upward and to move away from where he is and to begin a journey. towards the higher self, which he does spontaneously as a result of his actions. And how does he attain this higher state? Well, it assumes that we have a philosophy. It assumes that you have the Vedanta philosophy. That is, you've heard about your higher self. The lower bird has an image of a higher self. That's the presumption. If he has no idea of the higher bird, he would just go on living there, pecking the sweet and bitter fruits without end. So the image of the vision of the higher bird is the crucial determining factor. And doing his work, so we can answer our question here, how do we attain this state? How do we work with detachment? Swami Vivekananda, Karma Yoga there, he says, do your work. Always keeping the knowledge of Advaita in your pocket. This is the teaching. Do your work. Now remember, this morning we're talking here, I don't have my watch or my clock, but whatever. Do your work, always keeping the knowledge, good, of Advaita. Do I have a little time? Yeah. Okay. In your pocket. Now this is our approach this morning. You remember, on other occasions, we're going to discuss this same subject of karma yoga, and we're going to approach it from quite a different perspective. But my title this morning, we're not talking here about non-attachment. We're talking about detachment. And we're talking about a philosophical approach to detachment. That is how your Vedanta philosophy, that's our philosophy. Maybe I'm taking a lot for granted here, I know, but you have a philosophy. What is my philosophy? Well, I'm a divine immortal soul. We outlined what are the basic beliefs of my philosophy. I have a higher self. I am, that is my true self. How can I work with detachment? Do your work, always keeping this idea in your pocket. That means you don't always have to be thinking about it. It's not as if you're repeating a mantra. It's not as if you're saying prayers all day. It's not as if you're, it's not that. It's just that you have a philosophy. And you are serious about practicing and practicing your philosophy. That is, you're interested, that is, you're a spiritual aspirant, and you believe that your Vedanta philosophy is a philosophy of life. Not just a bunch of ideas that you study on Sunday morning, but it's something that you want to apply in your life. Here's a perfect opportunity for you to apply it in your life. You're going to apply it in your life. How? Well, the bird, little bird, lower bird, how has he applied it? Well, he's hopped up a couple branches. Then he's got distracted again. Then he looks up, reminds himself of a higher truth, and just that thought. You see, if you change your philosophy, your whole life changes. Your feelings change, your speech changes, and your behavior changes. That all happens automatically once you change your fundamental beliefs that you have about yourself. Once you believe that you are that higher bird, or you aspire to realize that and instantiate that, as we all believe that, that's our philosophy, but we have not yet instantiated that in our person. And therefore, that's what we're going to struggle to do. And now let me shift here a little bit. Let me talk here about the higher self. That is the Atman, is the witness of the body, and the mind. What does that mean? That means that when you act, you're going to struggle to act in a way that's free from raga and dvesha. That is, in the yoga psychology, that all of our behavior is motivated by what? The carrot and the stick. That's all. Attachment, raga, means grasping, being drawn towards an object of attraction. And dvesha, that means rejection and avoidance of pain, seeking of pleasure, driven by the pleasure principle, the lowest denominator of the psyche. That's the id, is driven by the pleasure principle, which means we seek out pleasure, we avoid pain. At a higher stage of our psychology, we seek happiness, we try to avoid unhappiness. And the challenge here is to take even a higher step. That rather than seeking for the happiness and misery, pleasure and pain, loss and gain, success and failure, rather than that, we commit ourselves to our higher ideal, which is to identify with our true self and to observe and respond to the world with an attitude of what in Vedanta is called same-sidedness. Same-sidedness. That is impartial, objective, unbiased, detached. And a good analogy for this, and for this practice, comes to us from some teachings on the tradition of the Mahayana Buddhism. And there was well, actually, maybe this is not. So I'm going to quote to you a famous analogy from the Chuang Tzu, who actually was not of course, this was back in the 4th century BC when Taoism and Buddhism was all kind of part of one great thing in ancient China. But Chuang Tzu there, he says in one place, he's talking now about detachment. How do you work with detachment? And he says, employ your mind like a mirror. A mirror grasps nothing, and refuses nothing. It accepts, but it does not keep. So that's a pretty good analogy. For how do we employ now our mind? How are we going to employ our mind as Vedantins? Of course, now we have the Vedanta philosophy behind this. Chuang Tzu didn't. We have a different philosophy. But how do we employ our minds? We employ our minds as a mirror. What is the nature of the mirror? The mirror doesn't go out and grab things. No, doesn't grasp. And it does not refuse. The mirror doesn't refuse. It's completely detached. The mirror is the image of perfect detachment. It receives, but it does not keep. The mirror just remains unaffected. It perfectly reflects what's happened. It's fully responded to what is there, and yet it remains unmoved. And by its mere presence, doesn't do anything. But by its mere presence, it reveals everything that has happened. the past disappear, that which is everything is in change, the process here of change. The parade is walking by. The mirror fully reflects each thing that happens, but then the past is completely gone. The future doesn't anticipate the future. Remains fully present and aware, unchanged, and conscious of in the present moment. That's the nature of detachment. That describes how the jnani, that is, if you have realized your true self, then you employ your mind in that fashion. But now, as spiritual aspirants, the natural behavior of the siddha is the practice of the sadhaka. That is, we're not there yet, but we have the ideal. This is our ideal. This is kind of our vision. This is our higher vision. Let me tell you another Zen story. On one occasion, the Zen master Tenzan and his disciple Aikido was Aikido. I guess they were walking, journeying over hill and dale, along a pathway through the forest, and they were returning to their monastery. And they came to a swiftly flowing creek, and the bridge was out. There was no bridge crossing, and there were no stepping stones to cross over this stream. And nearby to the stream, there stood a lovely young girl in a kimono and a sash. There she stood, completely frustrated with how could she cross that river. And she didn't know what to do. And she was very confused and sad. And when she saw the monks coming along, she said, "Oh, revered sir, what can I do? Please help me to cross over the stream." And Tenzan, the Zen master, he says, "Well, okay, yes, okay, girl." Goes over, he picked her up in his arms, holding her in his arms. He waded into the stream, crossed over the stream. Aikido, the disciple, followed behind and came to the other side. He put the girl down, and the two monks continued on their journey to the monastery. And for a long time, you see, Aikido, the disciple, had observed all this, and his mind was in great turmoil. He was very upset by what had just happened, but he didn't say anything. And they went on and on. He kept quiet, but when they came in sight of the monastery, he just blurted out. He just couldn't contain himself anymore. He said, "Oh, master," he said, "I'm so disappointed with you. How is it? We know that you're supposed to be a great holy man. We know that monks certainly do not never associate with women, and that it's very dangerous to associate with women, even to look at a woman. It's very dangerous to do, let alone what you did back there, kicked the girl up, carried her across the stream." He said that was a very great transgression of monastic discipline. And Tenzan looked there as his disciple. He says, "I left the girl back there." He said, "Are you still carrying her?" So we can see the moral of that story. But Tenzan, the Zen master, He came there, he's filled with compassion. He acted in the power of attachment. That is, he put his whole mind on, engaged himself fully. He wasn't standoffish. He wasn't aloof. Fully engaged himself in the work at hand. But he employed his mind as a mirror. After the action was over, he went on, it was gone. And yet the disciple, Aikido, he couldn't let it go. He was all entangled. He was enmeshed. That's what attachment means. That you've become enmeshed in the situation, in the relationship, in the work. The problem is not doing the work. The problem is not working with attention, with full enthusiasm. That's not the problem. The problem is that if you get stuck and you lose the power to detach yourself from the work at hand. Now, okay, let me give you here the great analogy, or the great from the Bhagavad Gita. We go in the Bhagavad Gita, where this kind of work. Remember, we're talking here about karma yoga from a particular approach this morning. On other occasions, we're going to take a different approach. This morning, we're talking about karma yoga as a kind of a philosophical approach. In the Bhagavad Gita, it's called the Jnana Yajna, called the knowledge sacrifice. Now, the knowledge sacrifice, what does that mean? Well, in ancient times, you know, there's a Vedic fire rituals. And in one version of those rituals, or that ritual, you offer, maybe you have leaves, sacred leaves, and you symbolically offer your personal desires and your attachments one by one into the fire. And the fire, the purifying fire, consumes all those. It's kind of like the medieval bonfire of the vanities. And after having performed that fire ritual, the devotee is purified of all of his desires. Similarly, it is said that working with detachment, that means the knowledge that you are the divine immortal soul, working with that knowledge burns up all the fruits of the karma. And that as long as we disidentify, there's an element of disidentification, that is identifying with our higher self, and we are able to work without the action leaving its impression, that is the samskara in the mind. That is that by detaching ourselves, we weaken the imprinting power of the program, as it were. It doesn't leave, the action doesn't leave its impression on the psyche, and hence it doesn't throw that loop of binding power within us, which will commit us to the future action. That's the vicious circle of karma, which we've discussed in detail on other occasions. And so working like this with the fire of knowledge, is the analogy here in the Bhagavad Gita, that the fire of knowledge burns all karma to ashes. And this is why Vyasa could say that he had all eaten all of that food, and yet he could say he had done nothing. How is that possible? It seems like it's impossible. Well, that's the kind of the paradox. You see, of the two birds, there's really only one bird. Now, the analogy here that we can hold in our mind, if you take up any book from the Vedanta Society, there you will see that on the book there is inscribed a seal. That's the seal of the Ramakrishna order. Very helpful for us to contemplate This seal is an allegory for all of spiritual practice. And you've seen the seal there, where it's a kind of, you're having a scene. The scene is of a beautiful, beautiful lake. It's framed by a great a cobra, that is a serpent, symbolizing the Kundalini and the practice of Raja Yoga. And over the lake there is rising the sun, that's the sun of knowledge, that's Jnana Yoga. And there is blooming come up from the bottom, there's grown a lotus, and the lotus is lotus flower blooming there on the surface of the lake, that's Bhakti Yoga. But in the center of the picture, there is a swan, that is the Paramahamsa, the white swan, is floating on the wavy waters of karma. And that's kind of the image this morning of working with detachment. Our ideal is to be like that swan. That beautiful swan, as it goes, waves rise and fall. And he's in the water. Doesn't fly away. He's in the water. He's in the world, but he's not of it. And this is why Swami Vivekananda says, that man alone, same verse, that man alone will get the best out of life who, having the power to attach himself fully to the work at hand, you have to be able, all this presumes that you're able to fully sympathize and empathize and bond with everything, with people, places, and things, and your actions. That's the assumption. That's the prerequisite, that you have the power of attachment. But, he says, continue the verse there, you have that power to attach, but reserves to himself also the power to detach when he should do so. This is the secret of work. And this is the secret of work that's taught to us in the Bhagavad Gita. Do not fly away from the wheels. There's no need to fly away from the wheels of the world machine, but stand inside it and learn the secret of work. What's the secret? To work without detachment. If we can do so and hold this ideal in our minds and hearts, that gradually we can loosen the bonds of karma and we can realize the goal of karma yoga, which is to attain living freedom. Om Dyo Shanti Antariksha Shanti Prithvi Shanti Apa Shanti O Shadaya Shanti Vanaspataya Shanti Vishwe Deva Shanti Brahma Shanti Saravam Shanti Shantireva Shanti Same Shantiredhi Om Shanti 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 Om. Peace is in heaven, peace is on the earth, peace is in the sky and in the waters. The herbs and plants and trees are full of peace. The gods are peaceful. May this eternal, universal peace enter our souls and beings. Om. Peace, peace, peace be unto us all.